we can go ahead and get started. So yeah, I was saying this is the first of many Burning Bridges sessions. We're trying this Twitter Spaces format for now, and like recording it as a just because it's a simple way to get everybody in here. But if it doesn't work, we can try moving to something else later. In this what is it? Session, stream, panel?
Session, I think. Iteration. Powwow.
Yep.
That's good.
So basically, the goal of this is to kind of like talk through, the kind of hook is that we're going to be reading through like white papers of different interop and L2 projects and poking holes in them and talking through, trust minimization, talking through crypto economic security, talking through a lot of these like more complex research-oriented topics, which are generally not talked about enough, and there's really not enough approachability to them. For this session, we're going to start by just giving a little bit of background on ourselves, and then talking through some like intro material around what some of these terms are and like why they matter and why decentralization in general matters. And then if we have an hour session scheduled, so if we have time towards the end, we'll also jump into layer 0 as a first white paper to kind of look through and understand the trade-offs around. And then if we don't have time, we can push that to the next session. But yeah, I guess to start with, maybe we have Daniel, Connor, and Pranay on with me today, who will be my co-hosts going forward. But if you, I guess, would the three of you like to begin by introducing yourselves and the projects you're working on, and a little bit give a little bit more information about like your experience in the space?
Sure, I can start. Hello, I'm Daniel. I work at Off-Chain Labs, where we're building Arbitrum, and I do primarily software engineering as well as kind of protocol research and design and things of that nature. Did a fair amount of work on the sort of token bridging architecture, which is I guess why I'm here. Either way, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invite, Arjun. And just have generally been sort of thinking about the bridging ecosystem. I'm also technically still on a Twitter break, but I decided Twitter Spaces don't count. So just before anyone points it out, that's the rule. That's all. You want to go ahead, Pranay?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Pranay. I am very bad at installing mobile apps on my phone, so that's why it took me a while to get in here. I was like Eric Andre for a hot moment.
You actually installed it pretty quickly once we realized what was going on. It was pretty fast, so I think you did well.
Yeah. I mean, that's most of debugging, right? It's like 90% of the time is spent figuring out the problem, and then 10% is solving it. So, in any case, I work on Nomad, which is an interoperability protocol that uses an optimistic mechanism, kind of chooses a different spot in the trade-off space for interoperability, where kind of if we think about the parameters as cost, speed, and security, we're focused on increasing security and keeping the costs low, with the trade-off being that there's a mild latency introduced. And I kind of work on product and business side of things, but my background is in engineering. I've kind of been on the protocol side of crypto for a while, and I'm excited to see the infrastructure cycle turn to interoperability, as Arjun says, as a more nuanced way to scale. And I'll pass it on to Connor.
Hey, everybody. My name is Connor. I also work on Nomad, and I've been kind of serially working with Pranay for the past couple cryptos at this point. And I'm more on the engineering side of things, kind of deal with our bridging and integrations and partners and all that stuff. Very excited to kind of be talking about other bridging protocols because I think we do it pretty good, but everybody can always be doing it better.
Awesome. And I'm Arjun. I'm one of the founders of Connext. I've been in this space since 2016, and I've been doing L2 research since 2018. We've actually been like, I've known Daniel and I guess Pranay and Connor I didn't meet until recently, but we've kind of like researchers have sort of known each other for a long time because like everybody is it's a very small community, and there's everybody's kind of working on tangentially similar problems. yeah, I wanted to put this together because I think there's a big information gap between the the work that people in the research community are doing around trust minimization and trying to understand the trade-offs between these different types of technologies versus the kind of broader consumer population within crypto, and trying to even though there's 100% many different options out there, many different ways to just do things with blockchains. All of the there's always trade-offs. All of the systems that you see being built, regardless of whether they're layer 2s or whether they're interop/bridging systems, all of them have trade-offs. And if they don't have explicitly enumerated trade-offs, then those trade-offs are ones that they just don't want to tell you about. So yeah, without further ado, I think it might be a good idea to start talking about some of those trade-offs and talking about, why does this stuff matter? So I have some basic questions here, but it is a little bit more of a free-form discussion. So feel free to take it wherever you'd like. But I guess basic question number one: why do the concepts of decentralization, trustlessness matter? How do you define them, and why do you think they're important?
It's a hard question. I'll give it a stab though. I mean, I think probably defining trustlessness, I mean, we'll see if we get to the particular layer 0 white paper, but defining trustlessness is going to be an important thing because the word is used kind of loosely by some parties. But I think basically the way I think about, the stuff that we're doing, Arbitrum's a layer 2, Connext and Nomad are kind of bridging architectures, but these are sort of things that in various different ways enhance layer 1s, I guess. In terms of layer 2, it's sort of extending what a layer 1 can do, utilizing its block space better, more efficiently. With bridges, it's something like that, but also trying to sort of maybe connect different layer 1s, connect L1s to L2s and things like that. So in terms of why the decentralization or the trust minimization of these layers matter, it's basically, at its core, it sounds kind of simplistic to say, but I think it's true. The entire point of any of this technology, if it has a point, is to create, systems that are decentralized, is to create systems where, there aren't particular parties that have unilateral control over them. So if you start compromising that on higher layers, or at least if you're sort of willing to compromise that without limit on higher layers, on the bridge layers or on the, layer 2s and things like that, you kind of defeat the whole purpose to begin with. So as someone had said before, I think there is this spectrum of trade-offs that are worth discussing. But ultimately, when you start hearing someone say things like decentralization doesn't matter at all, or users don't care about decentralization, so why not do X, Y, and Z to cut corners? It's sort of just a roundabout way of saying we shouldn't be using crypto or blockchains at all, which, if you want to take that position, you can take that position. But if you're in this space, that's what you care about. So, and yeah, as you sort of said, the bridge systems like Nomad versus Connext, maybe even versus Arbitrum's bridge as well, make different trade-offs on this design space. But ultimately, the holy grail is decentralization. That was rambling. Anyone else want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, I will kind of veer, I guess, in a similar direction, but more phrased in the gospel of the corn, which is what matters is censorship resistance, right? We wouldn't be building any of this stuff if the existing systems did not gate people or pose a risk to kind of imagine that you are now antagonized by the system, by the people that control the existing systems. They can freeze you out, prevent you from having basic things like being able to pay people, being able to buy goods. And that is a terrifying risk, especially as kind of trust in authorities and institutions has eroded rapidly. And so censorship resistance, it happens in the physical world because it is hard to kind of get a monopoly on physical reality, having all the factories in the world. Or it's doable. It's been done many times, and that's why antitrust exists. But there's more friction in that. But in software, there's this property called the zero marginal cost of replication, which means that like data, and as you scale, getting systems that ingest more and more data and have kind of the entire set of users locked in is very easy to get. That's why we have the FANG companies that have basically over the last 20 years consolidated massive power. And so what I see all this technology doing is the feature is adding friction. It is making it hard for any one person to kind of have entire control over the system and introducing speed bumps that enable multiple parties to participate. That's why this like artificial scarcity property comes in. Like we basically introduced scarcity into software in order to make it more censorship resistant. And that has trade-offs. Like you shouldn't be using crypto for everything because in some places efficiency matters more than censorship resistance. But in certain things like payment rails, I think we are realizing that it is worth making the trade-off such that the long-term future is secured rather than the expedient short-term needs of any one individual. I think I also rambled, so I'll pass it off to Connor or back to you.
I don't know. That was super insightful for both of you. I kind of take like more of a paranoid approach to decentralization. Like if you don't build a system where nobody can abuse it, then eventually somebody's going to abuse it. And then we see this in kind of Web 2 land all the time, especially when it comes to kind of governments and state actors forcing entities to hand over information or turn off accounts, prevent access for a particular user. And that's why decentralization is important to me. But the question I kind of pose to the rest of you is how do we build systems that either abstract this away from the user or how do we help users care about decentralization? Because I'm not sure which one of you mentioned the whole idea that if users don't care, we shouldn't build it for them. I obviously completely disagree with that position. Love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, just before we get into that, actually, I just want to go back to one thing Pranay said about
no worries.
The core of it, yeah, the core of it being censorship resistance, which I think that's basically right. And I basically see it the same way that decentralization is sort of a means to an end, and kind of the nicest way to summarize that end is censorship resistance, right? That's why they want to decentralize. I think there is a slightly sort of maybe in some sense less important or less vital use case, but one that's a little bit broader and maybe is less in the, let's say, paranoid direction, which is to say, like, even there's value in having sort of these decentralized, incredibly neutral platforms, even in certain cases where there might not be a party actively trying to censor you, just because it makes coordination across independent parties easier. So when I think of things like, cross-border payments, for example, in the in traditional finance or outside of the crypto space, which everyone kind of just agrees are just like unnecessarily shitty and awful. And part of the reason that you can sort of bypass that with things like cryptocurrency systems is simply that you have this ability to directly verify and coordinate without having all of these like intermediate layers of communication of sort of, you have these like different software stacks, and then you have systems that are built to communicate between them and so on. So it's close to censorship resistance, but again, it's less, there's less of a paranoid thing. It's almost like even if everyone's behaving nicely, it still is convenient to have a credibly neutral layer. So yes, but that's all. Yeah, all part of decentralization, I think.
I've heard that be called blockchain as an excuse. So like when IBM goes to a company that has COBOL systems and they kind of talk about Hyperledger, that is a opportunity for the person on the CIO on the other side to basically go back and say, we have this really sexy new technology called the blockchain, and it can replace our COBOL mainframes.
Yes, and certainly, I mean, yeah, blockchain. It seems like even just like calling this tech blockchain generally has fallen out of style, and that's probably good because it kind of just evolved into a marketing term. But yeah, I should clarify. Yeah, like simply using blockchains doesn't necessarily solve the problems I described. But again, using sort of public, permissionless, credibly neutral blockchains might. And in some sense, what we're seeing, like the fact that there is such thing as a DeFi ecosystem, proves that that's sort of proof of concept for this.
Right. So I think Connor brought up something pretty important, which is just like, like what do we do in the case that like people don't care about decentralization. Like people do talk about how consumers don't care about that. Consumers don't care about trustlessness. And I mean, frankly, they don't, right? Like there is so much evidence to show that that's the case. I guess like taking a step back, I agree with a lot of the points that are made here. I think, there are meaningful reasons for why decentralized systems should exist. We have seen from other, like the biggest kind of piece of evidence here is the internet itself, which is like the first ever piece of globally public infrastructure that really generally supersedes governments, supersedes like sovereign actors, supersedes mega corporations. And while it is getting more centralized today, it is still like largely outside of the control of any one entity. And I think that's incredibly powerful. I mean, there's been a lot of, there are certainly problems, new kinds of problems that have been created as a result of the internet existing. But despite that, generally the internet has been a very, very powerful force of good. It has helped equalize access to information. It has helped pull entire countries out of poverty. It has helped start revolutions in places that are authoritarian that never had access to information. And the theory is that like taking more systems that exist in the world today that are sovereign and then making them super sovereign, making them sort of globally permissionless, making them able to be accessed by anybody in the world in the same way that the internet is able to be accessed by anybody in the world. Doing that, in theory, can help us basically have the same effect with a lot of these other important pieces of the human experience, like access to financial infrastructure, governance, the ability to build and create things, the ability to earn. I guess the difficulty is that, it's difficult for people to understand the benefit of these pieces of infrastructure when we aren't in a time where there is actively a war being waged on crypto. And we aren't in a time where there is actively a war being waged on crypto. So how do we help users understand that, or maybe not even help users understand, but what do we do about the situation where users don't care about it right now, simply because there isn't anybody that's going after centralized systems and trying to attack them?
Yeah. This kind of goes back to the whole idea of like users don't, care about decentralization as a feature. Building products and, solutions that they can use that, have decentralization kind of tucked away underneath the hood, but, building features and things that those users will love. So for example, in the context of bridging, building a bridge that is fast and, it's my money and I need it now. So just building features that they actually care about, and kind of spoon feeding them decentralization with the sugar of fast liquidity, for example.
Yeah, kind of echoing off of that, it's kind of like the Ponzi's and yield farming is like a great gateway drug into decentralization, where you get people hooked onto like 50,000% APYs, and as a byproduct, they start using Ethereum. And then hopefully some non-trivial percent, 10, 20% of that top of funnel starts learning more about Ethereum and then understanding the zeitgeist. And the hope there is that we are able to kind of explain these things well enough to those folks such that they can begin digging deeper themselves, getting the tools and the abilities to understand security models and make decisions from first principles. And I think that's getting at the core of your question, Arjun, which is how do people who have not like been in crypto for 4 or 5 years, like some of us, and have studied different systems, be able to evaluate the trust models in them? And I think it would be really hard to expect this stuff to scale, to become world scale, if we expected everybody to do that. So my I guess thinking here is get them hooked, having something fun. Maybe they start playing games or making money, and then some of them start exploring these things. And then some of those people that explore and understand these things may have clout and influence in the real world. And getting those folks on our side, getting them to advocate in kind of in regulatory environments, talking to regulators, I think that has to be the way to go, because you can kind of think about decentralization as a seatbelt, right? Like car manufacturers are not going to add seatbelts. People don't care about seatbelts until they get into a crash. But as a whole, as a society, we want them so that in aggregate, we're all protected. And so you have laws and you have regulations that come in to enforce these things. But yeah, I know that is kind of a spicy take because so much of the zeitgeist of this industry is anti-government, anti-regulation. But we need to convince people of the good properties of these things such that they start advocating for us in the forums where real people live.
Yeah, I think it's also, going to the part of your question, Arjun, about how, it's sort of, I forget exactly how you phrase it, but it's almost like, it feels like in some sense, these intense walls of security we're building are currently overkill, right? Because we're not in this heavily adversarial environment, right? And it's like, I don't know, having an army tank parked in front of your front door and like, no one's even trying to break in. What are you doing? So that becomes it's a hard sell in some ways. But again, what I would say is, one way to think about the current state of things, and one way, if the goal is to, entice more people to use the sort of decentralized applications that are, truly decentralized and truly utilizing the technology as it should be. One way to entice users is to focus on the use cases that, despite the fact that no one's actively trying to censor, or we're not in an adversarial environment, they are still useful in their own right, and for example, I think what we're seeing with DEXs and the growth in the past few years is an example of that, where they're, in terms of liquidity, in terms of volume, they're competing, and in a lot of cases superseding centralized exchanges, which actually surprised me. But the reason for that, I think a lot of that is actually just that in many cases, these are useful things. This is a useful way to trade. I know people, in fact, my roommate, who may or may not be able to hear me right now through the wall, he wanted to, there was, some token he heard about, he wanted to invest in it, and he was, hadn't really been in crypto before. The way he acquired it, just on his own, naturally, was via Uniswap. Not because he ideologically cares that Uniswap is the most decentralized exchange, but that just was the easiest way, right? Like, he didn't have to KYC. I think it was actually cheaper at the time, So just realizing that, again, just that this is a neutral platform, it actually in some cases offers better UX than centralized solutions, which is like, in a way, surprising and counterintuitive. But that's one approach. I would also, I don't want to go on too long. There was a lot in your question that was very good, but I do sort of, I struggle with this question sometimes of yes, this idea of like users not caring about decentralization, which as you say is just obviously true to a large extent. But I think it's also important that we distinguish between, there's sort of two classes of situations. There's of users not caring about decentralization. There's cases where they're kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, wrong not to care. And then there's cases where they're totally right not to care. And I think, I'm sure, this is not, everyone on this panel will agree with this. This is not particularly profound, but, there are plenty of cases where things like blockchains and Ethereum and so on are being used where it really just shouldn't be. Long story short, if it's a case that is equally served by a centralized solution, then it's insane to use Ethereum almost, right? Because you can just, you're using just the slowest, most expensive database, and like, we've had database technology for a while. That infrastructure is built out, you can use that. There's no like weird unsolved problems that you have to read about on ETH research. So, there are plenty of cases where you simply don't need it. And I think we need to sort of make that clear also. It's not as though everything can or should take place on these decentralized layers. Places where I would say users are sort of wrong not to care about decentralization, sort of the simple other side of that spectrum, would be something like, a form of centralization, for example, is an application that like, has an admin that can, quite literally rug the user of all their funds, let's say. And like, by the way, that admin is some pseudo-anonymous account. No one knows who it is. And maybe it's rugged a few people already. Like, a user who doesn't know that is, and says that they don't care about decentralization is quite literally wrong not to care, because, they don't realize their funds could get stolen. So that's like the easy side. And then there is a lot of gray area, and this is what I struggle with. Things like NFT launches, where some NFT is coming out, and it's, it's clear that the team that's launching it, is going to be in charge for the foreseeable future. They're going to be, sort of, controlling the, they're in charge of the roadmap. They're the ones that you will effectively be trusting with the whole thing. and they see that, okay, there's various chains they could launch on, and some of them are just a lot cheaper, it does become, I like to see projects use Ethereum. I like to see them using Arbitrum, obviously, but for cases like that, I'm not exactly sure if the right move is to try to convince them to use the more decentralized layer, or to tell them, like, actually, for this case, centralization matters. So yeah, it's a tough thing, and I don't really know where the line is.
Awesome. I have a good follow-up question to this, but I'm just going to pause for a second because I can see that somebody requested to speak. So yeah, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to do that and jump in. So Tom, if you want to ask your question. Perhaps he missed it. Perhaps not.
Perhaps not. Tom, you are a speaker, but you are muted.
Hey, sorry, it actually turns everything off for a minute when it transitions you. I had a point earlier, but now I it's been a while and I forgot what it was. But
sorry about that.
No worries. I have a bunch of questions as you get into things. So if you don't mind, I actually love to stay here because I'm super excited about this topic.
Sure. I guess, yeah, as a follow-up question, shoot, what was my follow-up question?
There was one more person who requested to speak, if we want to, I think. I'll just add.
I'm not seeing it anymore.
Them as a speaker. There.
Okay. My follow-up question was more about, so you touched on progressive decentralization, which I think is a really important topic because there is progressive decentralization is a trope that is used both, like it is a legitimate thing in the sense that, like, it is pretty much impossible to like launch any sort of decentralized system in a way where it's decentralized and trustless from day one. If you do that, you are just the amount of risk that you are taking is massive. And and I'm sure you guys, anybody who is in this session who has launched a decentralized system will know that, like, very quickly it gets out of control. You rapidly lose the ability to actually do anything in the system. If something breaks and users come and complain to you, the only thing that you can really do is, like, put your hands up and say, okay, well, hopefully somebody fixes it. And so, having something be like fully decentralized from day one is also difficult and not always desirable. But at the same time, there is this trade-off that exists, which is that having, under the guise of progressive decentralization, I think there's a lot of projects that also just do things that are very not decentralized. One thing I'd love to hear from you guys about is how you guys think about progressive decentralization as a concept, and, like, what are ways that projects can do this successfully, and what are ways for users to gauge for themselves, is this project genuinely going towards being, a trust minimized decentralized system, or is it just saying progressive decentralization in the interest of shipping quickly and like getting a bunch of users?
Yeah, Daniel said something really interesting earlier, kind of around, like, if you haven't been or existed inside of an adversarial environment, you don't really understand the benefits of decentralization, a la, like, nobody can compel you to do anything because you're not in control of it. The whole, like, oh man, where was I going with that?
No, this is a really good point. Keep going.
No, it was such a good point. It distracted you. I understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
It blew your mind.
Well, just to give, like, everybody a quick blurb here. So when we talk about adversarial environments, what we're basically saying here is, like, a part of the reason why we are decentralizing these systems and making them trust minimized is we talked earlier about, like, making sure that they stay censorship resistant, making sure that they stay resistant to, like, corruption by external actors. And, like, this is in the security space, we call this your threat model, which is basically, like, who is attacking your system, what can they do in your system, how many resources do they have. And the theory is that with blockchains, especially, like, things like Ethereum, eventually you want to get to the point where your system can withstand an attack from sovereign level bodies. It can theoretically stay resistant to censorship, even if tomorrow Jeff Bezos decides to just buy as much staking power in your chain as possible. And that's obviously quite difficult to do, which is why you want to try to build systems that rely on the security of other systems underneath them as well. So like this is the whole kind of ethos behind layer 2s and Ethereum, is that Ethereum is by far the most crypto economically secure chain in the world right now. I think it costs about $2.2 million to DOS Ethereum for 1 hour right now. And so if that's the case, then if you're kind of like building your own entirely different system, if you want it to be trust minimized, the most trust minimized you can get is to just have it like leverage the existing security of Ethereum. And that is why we took 3 to 4 years to research rollups, because rollups are the only architecture that we've seen so far that really does this, that where like you have an EVM like environment that inherits close enough to all of the security properties of Ethereum that it's worthwhile to build on top of.
Yeah, I found my thought. I had to take some notes because I'm not able to riff as much as you guys are. Basically, like the traditional kind of adversarial actor that kind of Arjun was kind of alluding to here is like it's the legal system. If you can't build a system that can withstand a subpoena from a court, for example, that could potentially be bad, or that is bad in the context of kind of Web3. And kind of going back to the whole idea of like centralization is control. Centralization is super helpful in the context of I'm building a new technology system. I'm not sure if it's going to work yet, but I'm going to just put it out there and see if users want to use it, and I can help them out. But this is kind of like a trade-off between kind of centralization being helpful to developers and centralization being helpful to developers to kind of be malicious. Rug people, steal users' funds, kind of Ponzi, etc. And going back to the whole idea of you don't know war unless you've seen it. You don't know an adversarial environment unless you've seen it. Developers of decentralized protocols have to either have experienced that or imagine what an adversarial environment would look like, because normal users just don't know what they're missing, or don't know how bad it can be until the feds come knock on their door and take their keys. If you're posting your seed phrase to a login service that's just hosted on somebody's computer somewhere, what's to say that somebody's going to compel them, or that somebody's not going to compel them to give them your key, for example?
Love the low key BitClout shade there. You gotta love that. I think this is like that. There's this trope online which is like hard times create strong people create good times create weak people type of thing. That's kind of what we're getting at, where in bull markets, in really good times, we kind of don't really need to be decentralized because there's too much going on. There's not that many attacks. Things aren't trialed by fire. So it's easy to lose sight of what could happen. And I think the key thing is what you mentioned, Arjun, is that systems need to eventually be resistant to state level attacks or attacks by coordinated individuals and parties with lots of money and lots of time to be able to take these systems down for whatever reason. And the key thing there is, what is the limit? What is the limit of decentralization or trust minimization that these systems offer? Because I don't actually dislike the progressive decentralization framework. I think it is good because it's kind of an evolution on the lean startup idea from Web 2 or the previous era of the internet, which is if you wait to make your thing perfect, by the time you ship it, the market will have moved on. So from a go-to-market standpoint, you need to be just good enough to be able to put it out there and get people using it, because only then will the people tell you feedback about your product and what you need to change in order to make it better. Then you find product market fit, and then you become successful. Your product wins. That is obviously easier in the old world because you can basically update your code and ship it and CD allows you to update the web app in real time. But that doesn't work for Web3 or crypto because it is really hard to replace something or push the limit of how decentralized it can be once you've already made some inherent security trade-offs or made your decisions in the trade-off space early on. And so I think the key here is there are going to be projects that come out and say, we're the best thing since sliced bread. We've discovered the new we've solved the scalability trilemma or whatever the new incarnation of that is. And people will be alert to that because that's a really good kind of talking point and sell. But I think I saw Philip from LeFi and Rishab from Mover in here earlier. I think at that layer where the consumers are interacting with bridge aggregators or whatever the GUI is to use the protocols under the hood, I think it's on those teams to kind of help educate users from a security model standpoint. Kind of like, I know Yelp is not a great company to reference, but kind of like how Yelp reviews restaurants or allows people to kind of rate things. It's super easy to see the cost and speed of something. It's much harder to kind of objectively understand the security model. And so having these trusted proxies and people that kind of have been in the space and can speak out that new users can listen to would go a long way in helping them understand what is the limit of a system, and are these people actually using progressive decentralization to get there, or is that just a talking point to kind of settle in a local maxima and make a lot of money and then peace out to an island somewhere?
Hey guys, so I kind of think of decentralization as not binary, but more as a gradient, and it also tends to be on like multiple factors. So like different aspects are decentralized to different levels. If you guys agree with that, maybe it would be helpful to kind of define what those different factors are and kind of what the different levels might be. It would help in evaluating the different projects that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to just differentiate a little bit between decentralization as a concept and then trust minimization, right? Currently, rollups are not decentralized. There's a centralized sequencer posting data to chain, but they are completely trust minimized. And obviously, there is a roadmap to getting them to the point where they're decentralized, so that no one can censor rollups. No one can use the centralized sequencer as a point of failure, and in order to stop certain types of people from transacting on the rollup. Because it sort of gets to the same question of okay, well, if you make it censorable, people are just going to build something else if they want a non-censorable experience. Given that that's the case, I think there's a few different levels. I think the base level is trust minimization. While there are trade-offs around trust that exist, I think as a space, especially given the amount of value that is controlled within crypto right now, which is multiple trillions of dollars, it is really, really important that people's code is trust minimized and people's systems are trust minimized. And the reason for that is just that it's even if you just think of it crypto economically, and by that I mean, what is the amount of money required to attack the system? You can look out into the ecosystem and see that actually there are a lot of systems that are actually just completely insecure. And while nobody has exploited those systems yet, it's only a matter of time. So good examples of this are, AnySwap is an example of this, where it's there is a certain amount of value staked in AnySwap. Actually, I'm not even sure if staking is live yet, but there's a certain amount of possible value that could be staked in AnySwap, and right now the TVL of AnySwap is much higher. And what that means is that the nodes in AnySwap have an economic incentive to try to rug users. I think beyond that, getting to decentralization and the kind of decentralization, progressive decentralization roadmap is more the things that are okay, well, how many operators are there that are running this network, and how much fault tolerance is there? And then it gets to how much control do teams have on the upgradability of the system or on XYZ, and then eventually it also gets to okay, well, who is actually marketing for this? Who is making any decisions whatsoever? Who is being a thought leader? Are the thought leaders just one core group of people, or is it a larger group of people that anybody can where anyone can participate. So I would say, like, in terms of levels, to me it feels like, and I know that this is a bit of a controversial take, but to me it feels like trust minimization is probably the first thing, first and most important thing, just because it's like, if you aren't trying to find ways to make sure that your system stays cryptoeconomically secure, it is only a matter of time before it gets exploited.
Yeah. Just kind of like riffing on Tom's question of like the spectrum of, you know, decentralization or trust minimization, maybe. Kind of like on one side, you've got maybe the custodied, you know, centralized custodian. And on the other side, you've got maybe a decentralized protocol. And the thing that the property I find really interesting about this is that these two things, you know, on either end are completely undifferentiated from the user's perspective. Like, all the user cares about is, you know, they're able to swap funds, for example, in the case of a centralized exchange to a decentralized exchange. But on the one side of things, you know, you have the legal system guaranteeing that the user will get what they're getting, because if they don't, they have recourse in, you know, a court of law. But on kind of the other end of the spectrum, you've got math guaranteeing that the user is going to get what they can, what they're going to get. And this math is completely verifiable, you know, and kind of it's verifiable by a third party. And I think one of the things I'm really excited to kind of dig into in these Burning Bridges series is, like, you know, living on kind of that decentralized protocol end of the spectrum, because obviously we can all agree that by the merits of the mathematics, like, the centralized custodian is you know, not the best solution. But there's a whole bunch of trade-offs on kind of the decentralized end of things. And I'm kind of, you know, maybe excited to talk to Daniel and Arjun a little bit more, and obviously Pranay, about some of these trade-offs.
Yeah, the way I kind of think about the word decentralization is obviously, as everyone said, it can kind of, the word encompasses a lot of different things, and, you know, there's sort of a lot of different dimensions that you could be talking about, or different axes of things that can be various, you know, that can be decentralized. And, like, some of those axes are sort of vague spectrums, but actually some of them are, I would say, basically binary. So, like, a vague spectrum sort of thing you might be talking about with decentralization, you know, is maybe the broadest one is something like, you know, who just on a social level has sort of control or sway over protocol changes, like Ethereum layer 1, you know, to what extent does the Ethereum Foundation have a say? To what extent does Vitalik have a say? To what extent do I personally have a say in what changes go through? And that's like a very, you know, you obviously can't quantify that. It's very vague, and that just has to do with, like, the social dynamics of this ecosystem. But, like, it's important to say that there's other things you might mean by decentralization that are binary. Like, words like permissionless, I would say, is pretty concrete. You know, there's some aspect of the protocol, and either in principle anyone can participate in it, or, like, this fixed set of people can participate. This fixed set of addresses can participate. So I think it's a good question what you asked, Tom, and I'm not signaling you out in this next part. But sometimes when I see people say, "Oh, decentralization is a spectrum," it's a way of weaseling out of some of the ways that it actually is more concrete, and they're just talking about something where they wanna be a bit vaguer. Yeah, and yeah, no, the question of progressive decentralization is one we obviously think about a lot at Arbitrum, and I'm curious, you know, I don't know to what extent you guys have publicly talked about the sort of what you're planning for Nomad, or even for Connect, but I am curious what your general thoughts on that are, particularly what Arjun asked is, you know, of this thing of, you know, there's good reason for users to be, I think there's good reason for users to be kind of cynical when they hear about, we'll decentralize the protocol later. It's just sort of these, you know, it's like the checks in the mail. It's like almost like a go-to lie in the space, or it has been for a while. So how do you tell a user that, like, this time it's different, or how should a user even determine that? And, you know, I can just say, you know, this is not an easy question, and it's a frustrating one in a way, because, you know, progressive decentralization feels like this necessary evil. We'd rather just not have to do it. But with Arbitrum, our basic thinking is, yeah, as Arjun said, it's like, especially something like Arbitrum, it's very complicated, and the idea of just launching it, you know, and having it be immutable was just out of the question, despite the fact that we went through, many audits from independent parties, despite the fact that we, had it live on testnet and stress tested it in every way we could, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, there just sort of has to be this phase where people are using it, but we still maintain some control in case there's an exploit. The way we thought about doing this is, number one, we didn't want to open up to users, again, in this trusted centralized form until we actually had a full system implemented. In other words, everything you need for, Arbitrum, which is an optimistic rollup, is there. All of the code paths are there. They can be run. And in the case of, something like Arbitrum, this means, it supports full generalized smart contracts, and there's a full functional fraud-proof system. So like that's all implemented, and then we have these kind of trusted guardrails on top of that. And at least that sends a signal of like, okay, if we really never planned on decentralizing this thing, it would be kind of weird to put all this work into building all this, right? There's much easier ways we could just get around that and have something live immediately. So that at least, hopefully garners some trust in users. Also, I just think the most important thing is just to be as transparent and clear as possible about the current state of any system. And that's where, we've just truly done everything we could. It feels like, anytime we're talking about it, when we call it mainnet beta, any sort of blog post, we make it clear, like, here's the ways that it's still trusted and centralized. Any way you try to get to it, we try to put scary warnings. And it still like breaks my heart when I see users discover late that like, oh, I thought Arbitrum was fully decentralized. So that's a hard thing. And I'm always like open to suggestions of better ways to communicate that. But, here I am trying to communicate it again. Arbitrum still has trusted guardrails. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, could you actually like detail like, all right, what parts of your system are like decentralized, what parts are trust minimized, what parts are trusted?
Mm-hmm. So in principle, and it's like what if you just sort of examine it on a protocol level in terms of like what should we technically consider this thing trusted or trustless? Like right now we still we have a multisig which maintains upgradability of the contracts, which like that's kind of all you need to know, right? So in that sense, you are trusting that multisig will not do something malicious, just like plain and simple. There's other stuff I could talk about, but that's that's pretty fundamental, and it's still in that state. And yeah, right. Like here we are telling you we will progressively decentralize. We've already done that in certain ways, but that upgradability is still there.
And so you have a plan at some point to want to get rid of that, the upgradability, right?
Yeah, sorry, I just got cut off there. My Twitter app was warning me. I've been on Twitter too much today. Generally speaking, yeah, what I was saying is like the message to users is the goal and what you look for in decentralized systems is systems that don't rely on, provenance, identity, reputation, things like that in order to function. When you're in a progressive decentralized state of affairs, that kind of turns on its head. Right? You either just don't use the system, which is totally reasonable, right? You can just say, I'm going to wait. That is totally fair. But if you're going to use it, you should only use it if you indeed trust the team. So you want to make sure that like the team is putting themselves on the line. We're being very public. We're saying, we are responsible for this thing. You are trusting us. Here we are, here's our company's address and so on. Like that's the situation you want, sort of ironically. What you should be scared of is a situation where it's like a totally anonymous or pseudo-anonymous team also saying, hey, we're going to progressively decentralize and you should trust us. Like that you probably just shouldn't use. So that's what I would say to look for. And again, I see how that might not be satisfying to users, and that's why I totally sympathize with, we've seen this before, we've heard this story before, we've seen projects launch centralized and then just kind of phase out or never change it. Show me the money, I'll wait and see. That is a totally fair response to users. But I've been talking for a bit. I'm curious from the rest of the co-hosts how you guys think about the progressive decentralization, and to the extent you can talk about it, what you're sort of planning or what you've already done for Nomad/Connext.
Yeah, something that you kind of touched on here, Daniel, is that I think there's just like there's tools in the realm of like decentralization, there's tools in the toolbox of progressive decentralization also, and I think one of the things you're touching upon here is the idea of like leveraging instead of leveraging complete trustlessness, pulling out the user's kind of network of trust. If you don't, for example, if you don't trust the guy that wrote the smart contracts, We can find somebody to add to the governance multisig that you do trust, that will kind of add to your confidence that the safety of the system is in good hands when it's not in the full hands of crypto mathematics, as it were. This is obviously something that we're thinking about a lot over at Nomad. I think you brought up the whole idea of transparency, being as transparent as possible, communicating with the user base, proactively instead of kind of communicating when you get called out on something. Pranay, I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts as well.
Totally. Yeah, obviously we can go into kind of roadmap details on how exactly things will become more trust minimized, but we might we might run over if we start doing that. And so kind of what I want to touch on is the irony of what we're discussing, which is how can you trust that the core team will make the system more trustless? And I agree with a lot of what Daniel was saying, which is you kind of have to rely on signals and proxies in order to be able to make a evaluation on how much is this team actually aligned with the principles that they're espousing. And I really like that idea of if somebody is articulating the trade-offs, that's a good sign, because the lack of that implies that they may be saying there are no trade-offs, which never seems to be the case. So wherever there are invariants, look for the team to be kind of clear about what those invariants are and articulating what their position there is. Additionally, I will also throw out the kind of Silicon Valley trope of building in public, right? Like, is the code open source? Is the team documenting things publicly? Are they in Discord talking with community members? Are other community members getting involved and contributing code? And is the ecosystem as a whole growing? And I think this is why we all kind of like Ethereum, and rollups are a thing, because we not only know that the hash power of the base layer is strong, but that the control and kind of governance of the system is fairly well distributed, more so than other crypto ecosystems right now. And so part of what we need to keep an eye out for is the kind of diffusion of power. Is there more than one core team involved? Is the core team working to make that happen? And in the meanwhile, like, you just have to use your intuition, sorry to say that, to kind of judge the intent of the people. And there are proxies that we can call out, but at the end of the day, it's not a hard thing. It's a soft evaluation.
Yes, and you said it was ironic, and I think that's exactly the right word. It's very ironic, and it kind of sucks. Like I said, it feels like it's necessary evil, but it's sort of inevitable that there's going to be this temporary phase. And in the spirit of transparency, I think you can see it, but I pinned a tweet to this space where you can see, to answer your question in some more detail, Tom. You can see I just sort of outlined the current state of Arbitrum mainnet beta, and I would just add, sort of in a way, like in our defense, if you're the sort of user that thinks like there shouldn't ever be this phase, just launch it decentralized. There's kind of the reason to do it this way, the reason to start it with these centralized trusted guardrails and upgradability. There's kind of three things. One is the big one is, in case there's an exploit, we want to be able to recover from it. The other is planned upgrades, right? Which we still have like a few, not many, but like one or two that we know planned upgrades that we're going to do. The third one that's the trickiest, though, is the idea of launching something as complex as Arbitrum and having it be immutable right away is a little strange when even Ethereum itself is changing, right? ETH2 is coming along, but it's not, we don't have a total, absolute, concrete spec or guarantee of how layer one consensus is going to change. So, and this is another long-term question. The point of truly simply making it immutable and absolutely unupgradable, what you're sort of doing is you're offloading any decision into the Ethereum ecosystem in general, and you're kind of hoping and trusting that any changes that are made, any hard fork changes that are made to Ethereum layer one will be nice and consistent with Arbitrum. And that's a big, if nothing else, that's like a big decision and a big deal. So yeah, that's another consideration. But yes, suffice it to say that like whatever happens, the vision long term, or even like medium-ish term, off-chain labs cannot have any. I mean, they won't and cannot have any sort of like special protocol level privilege over the Arbitrum protocol. That's just not that's not what an L2 is, and not what it should be. And yeah, we're probably going to say more soon about some of the details of how we're thinking about the long-term vision. But yeah.
Oh, awesome. There's a lot of really, really good points brought up here. And I wish I could respond to all of them, but I think there's maybe like two really important things that I wanted to like flag as like things that maybe people should take away, and then also, just to answer Tom's question, maybe give a little bit more background about Connext and like how we think about progressive decentralization. So the two things to flag are, thing number one is, I totally agree with, I think it was Pranay who said this, that like if you ever see a project, if you're a user that is using a project or is planning on supporting a project, especially if it's an infrastructure protocol, a decentralized network, fine. If it's like a DeFi dApp, this is not as much of an issue, but like if it's an infrastructure network of any sort, and it has no discussion of the trade-offs and risks, that's always just a massive red flag. Like with decentralized systems, there are always trade-offs. That's actually the core name of the game for how these systems work, is like figuring out how to mitigate these trade-offs using a combination of cryptography and economics. But there are no perfect solutions because it's just an incredibly difficult problem to communicate across the world, right? There's an inherent assumption, which is called the two generals problem, an inherent assumption about the fallibility of communication. That means that all decentralized systems, all distributed systems, any system where two people are not in the same place and need to know what each other are doing, those systems are always going to have trade-offs, always going to potentially have problems. The second thing is about like what happens, I guess, like what can you look for in the teams themselves and kind of the ethos of the teams. And I think aside from just their words and actions, the other thing that I look for is whether the team is thinking long term. And the reason for this is that if you look at the history of decentralized systems, if you look at the history of, like, for instance, the last time that this happened really was like the peer-to-peer file sharing wars, where you had protocols like Gnutella and LimeWire and et cetera, coming up with different ways to torrent data over the internet. Torrenting was actually supposed to be one of the most critical technologies available to push data storage and retrieval out to the edges. So basically push it out to users and make it so that everything can be peer-to-peer. But all of those, most of those large protocols failed. And the only one that succeeded was BitTorrent, which is really weird because BitTorrent was like the gimpiest, dinkiest little protocol. It was very decentralized. There was just a lot of confusion about what was going on. They didn't even market it as a file sharing protocol. They marketed it as a free speech tool. And the only reason that BitTorrent won was because most of the other projects went really hard on marketing, went really hard on growth, grew and captured 100% of market share, and then got regulated. And I think we will start to see the exact same thing in this space as well, where the projects that are actually going to be caring about decentralization, the projects that are taking this like very long-term view of like, okay, how can we make sure that our protocol exists in 100 years? Those are the ones that are just going to be impossible to stop, right? Because the bottom line is that the whole thesis of this space is let's not just disrupt companies, let's disrupt, actual sovereign processes. Let's disrupt the way that this government thinks about money or the way that this XYZ large institution thinks about governance overall. That is going to be met with headwinds. There are going to be people who are not happy about that. And so you have to assume that either this year or next year or in 10 years, there are going to be network level attacks that happen from legal bodies, from potentially extremely wealthy people, from terrorist organizations. It doesn't really matter. And so, progressive decentralization is important because it helps us get to that point. But the bottom line is we have to be at that point. There is a deadline. We don't know exactly when that deadline is, but when that deadline happens, if you're not decentralized, your system will get shut down. It will. And that's why, I think like really good examples, for instance, are like Rye. I really like Reflexer because it's like even though it doesn't have the same kind of, like people don't think of it as a stablecoin the same way that they think of like DAI or other kinds of systems as a stablecoin. The whole point of Reflexer is not to be like the winning stablecoin for DeFi today. It's to be the only stablecoin in 100 years when there's nobody around to govern it anymore, because there is no governance in it. Eventually it is just like run on chain independently, and people can just interact with it. It becomes fully public infrastructure. And then I guess as the last point, so just circling back to like our philosophy on Connext's philosophy on progressive decentralization and like what we do, we've taken a little bit more of like a hands-off approach maybe than we should have, but I'm actually happy that we did because it's worked out kind of well. We don't control any upgrades. We actually don't really control anything. We run a router in our network, but then there's now also 23 other routers and hundreds more in the pipeline. So we sort of are in this interesting place where, like, when something breaks, we literally just have to tell users, hey, okay, well, we're going to have to talk to someone else somewhere around the world and figure out how to deal with this, but we don't have any control over it whatsoever. And same goes with upgrades. Like, our philosophy around upgrades is that, we don't love the like DAO-based upgrade model where, like, you have a bunch of people voting to make some changes to the contract, because, in theory, it opens you up to these attacks where, like, somebody can go and buy enough of your token and people could just not be paying attention. And now someone has, like, maliciously upgraded your contracts and stolen everybody's funds. But on the other hand, what we like to do is have the same kind of, like, upgrade mechanism as blockchains do, which is like hard forks, which is either you adopt the fork, or like either you adopt the system or you fork away. I think generally I have a feeling that people will find that that's a better upgrade mechanism over the course of the next couple of years. Yeah.
Are there any points of centralization with Connext?
There are. There's one major point of centralization right now, which is our messaging infrastructure. We use a messaging system called MATS, which is like a really high performance, like, distributed messaging system made for enterprise. The reason that we use this is because, like, it will take time for us to build proper decentralized messaging infra. There's things like libp2p, but there isn't a really good TypeScript implementation of it, things like that. So, like, the idea is, like, yes, that is a problem that is solvable. There is also a huge incentive for us to solve it, which is that we're paying for this messaging infra. So, like, if we don't solve it, we're just going to keep paying for it forever. And so we don't consider it to be like a problematic point of centralization, because while it's true that we could shut off the messaging and therefore shut off the network, the reality is that we are, like, overwhelmingly incentivized to decentralize it as fast as possible, because we're literally just burning money on it. Yeah, I would say the other places, of course, like, GitHub access and things like that. I would love to work towards having, like, DAO or protocol owned repositories. I think Radical is working on that, but, like, moving towards a model where, like, you can have a lot of contributors, but then the actual, like, ownership of a code base itself is, like, owned by a DAO or by a community.
And when you say hard forking in the case of Connext, is this just essentially amount to, like, redeploying and asking users to migrate, or is it something weirder?
Yeah, it's similar, except that in our case, like, our network is made up of, like, on-chain contracts and then also, like, off-chain actors that are coordinating with each other. And so in our case, it's like if either the contract interfaces change or if the messaging and, like, communication interfaces change, in either of those cases, that would be considered a breaking change to the network. And so, like, we need to sort of, like, coordinate hard forks in the network in the same way that Ethereum and other chains coordinate hard forks, which is that, if we deploy new contracts or change those interfaces, everybody needs to opt in and do it at the same time, or at least within a certain time period. Otherwise, like, you're going to end up with this, like, weird fragmentation. And then if people don't do it, then they'll just be continuing to run the old network.
Yep, makes sense. Cool.
I had a lot of fun kind of riffing on bridges with you guys. I got to run here in the next 3 minutes. I was wondering if you guys had some closing thoughts. We can kind of prep for the the next Burning Bridges episode.
I have a couple of things, but I can leave that at the end if anybody has any other thoughts or questions.
Yeah, I got to go as well, but I will leave the audience with maybe don't upload your seed phrase to Google Drive.
Yeah, definitely don't do that, please. Please.
Yeah, don't do that. I agree.
It's a good idea.
Those are closing thoughts. Yeah. No, this was fun. Thanks for having Arjun. And yeah, next time layer 0. That'll be fun too.
Yes. So for everybody who came today, thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be a regular thing now that we've kind of validated the format of Twitter Spaces. The session will also be recorded in case there was anything that you missed and you want to re-listen. But yeah, we'll plan another session probably in 2 weeks, where we'll have the whole session dedicated to layer 0, jumping through the white paper, trying to understand the security and trust trade-offs about it. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate everyone jumping on.
Thanks, y'all.
Beautiful.
This is
Thanks,
fun.
Arjun.